Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar, Anatomy of a Research Project. This is part one of the 5-part series, Research and Publication Basics. I'm Lisa Lorenzo, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Karen Snow. Karen is an associate professor and the PhD program director in the School of Information Studies at Dominican University in River Forest, Illinois. She teaches in person and online in the areas of cataloging, classification, and metadata. Her main areas of research interest are cataloging quality, ethics, and education. In 2016, she received the Follett Corporation's Excellence in Teaching Award. She brings much expertise to today's topic, and we are very fortunate to have her with us today. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for our presenter, please type them into the question box on your screen. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now here is Karen. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
All right, thank you so much. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. Thank you for the intro. Let's go ahead and get started. If you do have any issues, please feel free to type them, and I believe the other presenters will jump on that. But and as Lisa was saying, please type questions in the question box. If you feel free to do that as we go along, if you think of the questions, even if I don't get to them right away, we'll try to get to as many as we can today. All right. Let's see. Whoops, pardon me. All right. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to start with the learning outcomes. Okay, so these were posted ahead of time. So just to remind you, at the end of this webinar, attendees will be able to understand the research process and how to start a research project, understand the parts of a research project and how they work together, and identify various resources that can support research efforts. And so, disclaimer, I'm going to stick to this pretty closely, and I'm just going to give an overview of what I view as the research process that you'll see. And I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on each of these. This was really just meant as a way to kind of introduce you to the basic process for completing a research project, and not meant as an in-depth look at each individual part of the process, if that makes sense. So as you guys know, this is the first webinar as part of a larger series of webinars. So if you're interested in learning more about each part of the process, there's other webinars that you can attend. And also at the end of this webinar, I'll also give plenty of resources that you can consult to learn more about each part of the process. So like I said, feel free to ask the questions, but I may not be able to give the in-depth answers that you may want, kind of depending on what the questions are. So, okay, so with that said, I'm going to get started. Let's see, moving along here. Okay. All right, so first of all, I put together this little image here to show you what I consider to be what is called the iterative research process. And this is just kind of a combination of, from the various, readings, the understanding that I have, the readings that we have from various books on the research process. And I will have a slide listing the resources that I mentioned throughout this webinar, so you can consult them as well. But this is, I kind of wanted to put this together, it's something that I've done myself, so it's kind of breaks it down, I feel, hopefully, in a way that makes sense to everybody, that's not too intimidating. And maybe it is, maybe it's super intimidating, but hopefully it's not. And I'm calling this the iterative research process. Iterative meaning a repetition of the process. So I want to make sure it's clear from the very beginning that it's not like within the research process you go, okay, here's step 1, okay, now we're moving on to step 2, now we're moving on to step 3 without ever like looking back or revisiting anything, okay? So the reason why I have all these little arrows pointing to various parts of the process is because, oftentimes you find yourself starting at, like, for example, to define the problem, where it says start here, and then having to kind of, then go to the next step, the literature review, and having to kind of revisit the problem, okay? So that's totally normal. You may have to just kind of go back and forth through this process to feel like you are, defining your problem appropriately and completely, and so on and so forth, okay? So, same thing with, this, like the research design, the data collection and so forth. You may need to kind of go back and like revisit your research design if need be before collecting data, if you feel like you need to do that, so for whatever reason. So never feel like, just because you have to go back a step, then, you're a failure or anything like that. It doesn't really work that way. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this in just a moment. So let's start at the beginning where I kind of have my start here button in defining the problem. All right, so first of all, when you want to just do research, so I'm assuming that you're here because you want to complete a research project, or you are interested in possibly completing a research project. So where do you start? Okay, where does that even begin? Or maybe you have to, right? It's part of your job, like you have to do it. Where do I start? So first of all, I would say, for some reason my thing's not, okay, start with what you know, right? And I know that sounds really, really basic, but sometimes it gets really overwhelming when you think about everything that you need to accomplish from start to finish for a research project, and it gets really intimidating, especially when you see already completed research projects. You're like, oh, there's no way I can possibly do that. So, just one step at a time, like baby steps, right? So start with what you know. What topics interest you? What problems do you see? What is not addressed in the literature? If you're reading, like journal articles and books and so forth, what are you not seeing there that you would like to see, right? And it's totally fine as you kind of think about this to kind of think really broadly and not really worry too much about narrowing your focus yet. Because remember, at the very beginning of the process, you're just going to think quite broadly about just what is interesting to you, and then narrow down as you go, right? So it doesn't have to be something super, super specific right away. And this is something I talk to my doctoral students about, right? Because as they're saying, I am the PhD program director here at Dominican, and I, have worked with many, many different PhD students who may have some general idea about what they want to research, but they get, really anxious about the fact that they don't have something super specific right away. And that's okay, that's totally normal. It takes a little bit of time to get there, to get as specific as you need to be. All right, so sticking with this, define the problem. You do want to have something that is what we consider to be kind of a formal research problem, okay? So here, this is just a quote from one of the books that I recommend that you all look at. It's on, like the research methods in library and information science specifically, Conaway and Radford, where suitable research problems represent conceptual thinking, inquiry and insight, not merely activity. So simply collecting data and making comparisons are not activities representative of true research. So just as an example, let's say you just want to examine your technical services department's workflow and maybe compare that to the workflow of some other technical services departments. That's fine, you can totally do that, but that's not really formal research. You do need to kind of dig deeper with that in order to have a proper research project relating to workflow and technical services departments by researching it. Look at the literature, what's already been said about workflows. Maybe do a case study of various technical services department workflows and compare them and kind of look at it in a more conceptual nature, right? So not just looking purely comparing one to another. So we need to kind of go beyond that for a formal research project. All right, so which takes us to the next step within that diagram I showed is consulting the literature. Okay, so if you do want to do like a formal research project, you need to see where your project fits into the larger body of library and information science literature, and sometimes even beyond that, right? So depending on what you're asking, we need to figure out kind of where this all fits. So learn more, read, right? Just read a lot. What is known about your topic? So once again, if you're still just sticking with more general topic here, like, technical services workflows, what is actually known? What has been written on that topic already? Maybe where are the gaps? Has someone else already conducted a study that you're thinking about, right? That happens sometimes, right? You're like, oh, this sounds like a really awesome topic. I need to do this. And then you find out, okay, someone's already done it. And that's totally fine. It could be, though, if you really are interested in that particular topic, maybe the study that's already been done was done like 20 years ago, right? So it's totally possible to just like do that study again and maybe update it, make it more current, so to speak, right? So there's nothing to say that you cannot complete that study that's already being done, just maybe update it or maybe tweak it a little bit so it's a little bit different from what someone else has done. So you're doing, completing something new, right? So I mean, that's the idea. When conducting formal research, you really want to try to contribute something new to the literature, right? And the more you read, the more you'll see kind of what's not done yet, right? So where are the gaps? So once again, according to Conaway and Radford, a literature review describes the foundation on which the proposed study will be built by discussing published scholarship by others, evaluating their methodologies and findings, and stating how the proposed research will differ. Okay, that's really key because, at the same time, like I said, you don't really want to contribute something new to the literature, if at all possible. And when you're completing a literature review, it's always best to start with what is called the peer-reviewed literature as much as possible. So literature that has been reviewed by others in the field, ahead of time, so they can kind of check to see, okay, is this a solid methodology? Has this been done before, and so on and so forth. So and it usually will say when you look up a particular like journal online, for example, it'll say if it's peer reviewed or not. But also maybe books, specifically books, unless they're self-published, they have been edited by someone at a publisher, so you know that there's some quality assurance there, so to speak. So you want to focus on a peer-reviewed literature. However, there may be certain topics where peer-reviewed literature just doesn't exist. I mean, that's, if you're on the cutting edge and you have a topic that's not been touched before, it's fine. You can use non-peer-reviewed sources, just such as like, online, web pages, opinion pieces, blog posts, and so forth. But you do want to use that sparingly, if possible. Once again, it can provide context for your topic, because it's good to kind of have, something so you can show kind of what's been said already on that topic. But you do, like I said, if the peer-reviewed literature does exist, you want to kind of focus on that. And I do highly recommend any of my students who do research is to pay close attention to the bibliography or works cited list in that literature, either like I said, journals or books, because that will really help you find more, right? Because sometimes it's difficult when you just do a search of a database, for example, to find everything you need if you don't quite know. Maybe perhaps all the different keywords you need to use to find something. When I did my doctoral dissertation, I did a lot of like works cited list hopping around to various articles and books and so forth that it would have been a little I wasn't finding in my searches of databases. So once again, if you're trying to get a full picture of your topic, it's best to try to identify as many sources as possible in your literature review. And I know that it can be very overwhelming to do that, but that's just what you have to do, I think, in order to get a clear view of what's actually been said. And sometimes as you narrow your focus, which kind of brings me to my next point, and kind of refining the problem. That's kind of kind of what I consider to be kind of the next step is kind of taking your broad topic, your broad idea of like, this is what's interesting to me, and using that literature review to kind of narrow your focus. Because, you know, you don't want to just read everything. You do want to just, you know, focus on that literature that applies to your particular problem that you want to look at. And it'll, as you do that reading, you know, it'll be clear over time kind of what you want to focus on. So you want to take what you've learned from the literature review to create a study that builds on existing knowledge and is also manageable and realistic. Okay, so because it's one thing to kind of you know, want to choose something and study something and collect data on something that will change the world, right? You have really high expectations, but at the same time, if you do just, you know, need to complete a research project and publish for your job, you know, it may not be realistic and manageable to do something that's really, you know, quite broad and focused and so forth, or that changes the world. So just as an example, one thing, you know, that I was thinking of when I was trying to think of my topic for my doctoral dissertation many moons ago, is that I was cataloging in a technical services department, and I kept seeing on, you know, the email discussion list, you know, about quality cataloging. Okay, my doctoral dissertation was on quality cataloging, and people kept talking about just how horrible it was nowadays, and just, you know, going on and on about it, you know, just how people just don't know what they're doing anymore and cataloging. And I'm like, oh, this quality cataloging business is really interesting. You know, maybe I need to just define what quality cataloging is once and for all. So we stopped this bickering, right? And I'm, you know, very naive at the time, thinking I'm going to define what it is, right? And as I did, you know, as I read more and more about it, I realized kind of how naive it was and how not manageable that was because of, you know, a variety of reasons. But I mean, I think, like I said, it kind of comes with time. You don't know at first kind of how unmanageable something is until you start looking into it more and realizing, you know, you may need more time, money, or whatever. There may be ethical concerns, right? So maybe diving into a certain topic may raise some ethical red flags that may influence your choice, right? And so forth. So as part of this refining the problem, you want to create what's called a problem statement that clearly and explicitly explains the issues the study will tackle and why the study is needed, okay? So this is something, you know, we try to, you know, hammer into doctoral students' heads is kind of this so what question. So just because it's interesting to you doesn't mean it's necessarily interesting to other people that they'll care about it. So you do want to try to you know, describe your problem in such a way that once again, it's clear exactly what you're talking about, but also explains, you know, what's the point? Like, so what? Why should anyone care about this? And once again, it may seem obvious to you, but it needs to be something that's explicitly stated and made clear. So, so here, in terms of like the purpose of the problem statement, I just wanted to show you this in terms of like introducing the reader to the importance of the topic being studied. The reader's oriented to the significance of the study, right? So once again, you know, you've done a lot of research on this. You've read a lot of the literature. It's really clear to you kind of what this topic is and why it's important. You need to make it clear to the reader as well why it is, why it's significant. It also anchors the research questions, hypotheses, and assumptions to follow. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But it offers a concise statement about the purpose of your paper or your study. Place the topic into a particular context that defines the parameters of what is to be investigated. That's really particularly important, especially if you do have a topic that, you know, can be approached from many different angles. So, you know, just as an example, you know, my topic, I decided to definitely narrow my topic and not is, you know, what is quality cataloging, how to define this, but specifically, how do academic library catalogers perceive quality cataloging and how it impacts their work, okay? So I took that and I really tried to kind of refine that within certain parameters so that it didn't become too overwhelming for me, okay? And that's very, very clear, very important early on, is to really narrow your focus so that it just doesn't kind of spiral out of control and so forth. So be very clear, right? So when someone comes to you and say, okay, well, why didn't you address this? If you have a clear problem statement with clear parameters, you can say, well, that was not within the scope of what I was going to focus on. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on as well. And then finally, provide a framework for reporting results and indicates what is properly necessary to conduct the study and explain how the findings will present this information. Okay, so have that clear problem statement. And then they should be narrative in form and not just a series of bullet points. It needs to be clear. And just as an example, this is just one sentence. So usually problem statements are much longer to provide more context for the study. But here's just like one from this Conaway and Radford. I mentioned earlier, the problem to be resolved is whether providing undergraduate students with library instruction will have some effect on their use of the library. Okay, so very clear. You want to have at least like one sentence like that to make it just very clear precisely what you're going to focus on in the study and provide some context. All right. So here's just one example from the literature. I also have this listed at the end of my slides, this citation, but this one from the Journal of Documentation by Deborah Marin and Melanie Feinberg. What does it mean to adopt the metadata standard? A case study of Omeka and the Dublin Core. And I really like the Journal of Documentation in terms of kind of how they present the article and kind of in the abstract. They actually have the abstract kind of broken down into these sections. The first one being like the purpose, which not all journals do, but this one does. And so I like this one because it's very clear and kind of to the point. Like the purpose of this paper is to employ a case study of the Omeka content management system to demonstrate how the adoption and implementation of a metadata standard, in this case a Dublin Core, can result in contrasting rhetorical arguments regarding metadata utility, quality, and reliability, and so forth, and kind of keeps going, right? So so it doesn't even have to just be a sentence, but it needs to be, a narrative that kind of explains, okay, this is the point of this. This is the so what. This is what's going to happen, and why, the purpose of the study, right? So there, and I'll come back to this particular article in just a minute. All right. So the next part of the research process, and once again, I'm going to reiterate the fact that you may need to kind of keep going back and forth here, and maybe to kind of help continue refining your problem, you need to keep dipping back into the literature again and kind of keep researching. So once again, these are not isolated items within the process, okay? So you'll probably have to keep going back and forth to keep refining, okay? But once you have it refined quite a bit, then you can really, start in depth looking at the research design. And this is something that you can probably start thinking about at the very beginning, because as it says here, this is the plans and procedures for research that spans the decisions from broad assumptions to detailed methods of data collection and analysis. It involves the intersection of philosophical assumptions, strategies of inquiry, and specific methods. So, part of this and part of the research design, and this is why I was saying kind of having an idea of this at the beginning is also can be helpful, is whether or not you want to do quantitative research or qualitative research. This is a big part of research design. Keeping in mind that it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. You can actually have what's called a mixed methods approach, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And just in a nutshell, this is very broad assumptions here that, typically when people think of quantitative research, they think of like numbers, right? So closed-ended questions as opposed to qualitative, where it's, more words and open-ended questions, okay? But ultimately, that's a kind of simplistic way of looking at it. Ultimately, it's a difference in strategy. Okay, in terms of your research strategy, and they can be both of them can be very complementary. They're not necessarily in opposition. Both these research methods. In quantitative research, typically you do experiments as opposed to qualitative, more like, case studies and so forth. And quantitative have more like statistical frequency and correlation, versus in qualitative, we're more looking at meaning and interpretation. Okay, so you want to kind of think when you're thinking about and refining your problem, precisely kind of how you want to design your research to capture what you want to answer, if you want to make sense. So part of that research design process is coming up with questions that you want to answer from conducting your study, okay? So I like this, this little cartoon here at the very top left to kind of, once again, in a nutshell, very simplistic way of kind of, looking at quantitative versus qualitative methods, right? So we have the little person getting some free ice cream and the researcher hovering behind like a cloud or a big snow pile or something, I don't know. Only 1 in 30 take the free ice cream, interesting. testing, right? So that's kind of more of a quantitative approach as opposed to the research on the right, the qualitative methods, asking kind of like, what do you feel? What did you feel when you saw the free ice cream? And why was that? Why were you feeling that way, right? So it's trying to kind of dig deeper into kind of the meaning, right, of the why aspect of kind of why people do things with the qualitative. So in quantitative research, it's testing objective theories by examining the relationship among variables. So variables being a very important component of quantitative research, and maybe hypothesis testing, even and so forth. Whereas qualitative is exploring and understanding the meaning individuals or groups ascribe to a social or human problem. And this is, a very popular research approach, especially within the social sciences, of which we are, LAS is a part, right? Where we do want to have specific research questions and possibly sub-questions, right? So we can have, maybe like one research question with kind of some sub-questions there. Really gonna depends on how, multifaceted your study is. That attempt to tease out the whys and the hows, right? So whenever I do have doctoral students who are interested, in particular in qualitative research, because keep in mind quantitative will have some questions as well, right? I'm not saying that it doesn't, but you want to have with your research questions, you want to have those not as like yes or no questions, ideally. Okay, you don't want to say, is this ice cream good? And if you then the answer would be like yes or no. That's not really digging as deeply as you really should go in your study, right? So ideally having questions that begin with why and how and so forth is really important for qualitative research in particular. So, and like I said before, you don't have to solely rely on quantitative or solely qualitative methods. You can have mixed methods, so kind of using both of the approaches, and maybe you can just help kind of answer your questions and solve your problems, not solve the problems, but talk about the problems in slightly different ways, right? So just as an example, what information is searched for most often in a school library catalog and why, right? So within the quantitative approach, you can just kind of look at that solely as, okay, what exactly is being searched, kind of without digging too much deeper in terms of the meaning of that. But like I said, you can kind of bring these together if you want, depending on the scope of your study, right? Kind of what you want to answer. And so in sum, for the research design, like I said before, you want to have a very clear and specific problem statement, as well as research questions. And these will help you determine which research method is needed and what kind of data needs to be collected. And if you prefer one method over another, make sure your questions reflect that approach. And again, I talk about this all the time with my doctoral students, about how some of them say like, no, I definitely, the very beginning, right? They're like, I definitely want to do a qualitative study. I know I don't want to do quantitative or maybe do a mixed methods, but definitely focus on qualitative because I really want to understand the meaning for whatever, right? And so you need to have that, understanding of that kind of towards the beginning, because that will then affect, your problem statement, how you frame your problem, as well as your research questions, right? Because you don't want to ask, have research questions that will require you to do, more quantitative, have more of a quantitative approach if you're really hoping to do more of a qualitative one. Does that make sense? So you really want to keep that in mind as you kind of design your study to make sure each part of this, the problem statement, the research questions, the methodology you use are in alignment, so to speak. Okay. Also, a part of research design can be theoretical frameworks, which provide a general explanation as to what the researcher hopes to find in a study, or a lens through which to view the needs of participants and communities in the study. And this can be applied to both quantitative as well as qualitative research. So in terms of theoretical frameworks for quantitative research, in general, theory is used deductively in quantitative research, so a conclusion is drawn logically from a set of premises. It's used as a framework for the entire study, so it informs the questions asked, whatever theory that's chosen, how data are collected and analyzed, and is often tested or verified rather than created necessarily. So it may kind of depend on what's used. And in qualitative research, the same can be said, right? Because theory can be used as a framework for the entire study as well, in terms of kind of how the research is designed as well as analyzed, right? but it also can provide guidance on what, such as like marginalization and empowerment, or who, such as women, homeless, minority groups, to focus on, right? If there is a particular group or a particular topic that's really important within a particular framework, then it'll help guide you in that way, as well as apply like the positionality of the researcher. Okay, and that's something also that it's important to consider towards the beginning of your project, of kind of what are your biases, right? So what is your worldview, your history, and so forth that may impact your interpretation and the meaning of your particular study. So just as an example, like I said, I'm going to come back to this as well at the end, is it can be something as basic as like saying, look, I mean, for me, in my doctoral dissertation, I was looking at people's catalogers' perceptions of quality cataloging, and I was a cataloger myself, right? So that really helped inform my view of, you know, what I thought quality cataloging was and what I thought other people might say. And I, you know, when we talked cataloging, I understood when they started talking in marquees and RDA and so on and so forth. It was something, you know, that an outsider to this particular professional community may not understand, right? So I had kind of that insight that others, you know, outside the community may not understand, but it also kind of biased me towards, you know, it kind of blinded me in a certain sense for certain things that if I wasn't a cataloger, I may not have, I may have picked up on that if I wasn't a cataloger, if that makes sense. So having kind of that good understanding of kind of where you come from, like where, like I said, historically or professionally, a part of, you know, a racial group, an ethnic group, and so forth, it's good to have that good understanding of your positionality in relation to your research. Okay. And I like this little like graphic within this Cresswell and Puff book. I like this. It's specifically about qualitative inquiry and research design, but you know, so this is kind of more qualitative, but I think it's still helpful to think about in general. And once again, I have the citation for this at the end, pardon me, of my presentation. In terms of like just like phase one, the researcher is a multicultural subject. So what perspectives and experiences do you bring to your research? So that's something, once again, you can kind of think about, you can start thinking about at least the beginning of your research study, is kind of, you know, the history and research tradition of you as well as your research topic, conceptions of self and the other, ethics and politics of research, and so forth. And then moving on to phase two, the philosophical assumptions and interpretive framework. So how do your beliefs guide your actions as a researcher through these, you know, maybe one or various lenses that you can see here, and then taking that and understanding kind of what research strategies and approaches that would be best, you know, how your philosophical and theoretical frameworks inform your choice of research approaches. So we'll kind of more about that in just a minute. So kind of like that like flow here. And here, once again, kind of going back to this article in the Journal of Documentation, which, by the way, that journal is it's about, you know, like library and information science generally, not like technical services specifically, but you'll find, you know, technical services related articles in there. Of how, like, underneath, so I showed you guys the purpose before, but here they have like the design, methodology, and approach section of the abstract, where it says the paper uses an approach based on rhetorical criticism. And then, you know, paper aims to establish whether Amica's given ends, the position that Amica claims to take regarding Dublin Core, align with Amica's guiding ends, right? So Amica's actual argument regarding Dublin Core. So to make this assessment, the paper examines both textual evidence, what Amica says, as well as material discursive evidence, what Amica does, right? So that can be helpful in kind of, once again, framing the particular methodology and approach for this particular study. Also, critical theory has been very, very important within LIS research lately. This particular article by Emily Drabinsky is using queer theory as a lens through which to examine library classification structures and control vocabularies. Okay, so and so forth. So yes, it's viewing knowledge organization systems from a queer perspective and so forth. That's something that's been very popular in the literature lately. So, so once again, just kind of, we can have that there. You know, not all studies will necessarily have a very clear theoretical framework, even though they may, right? There may be a theoretical framework that the researcher is using that he or she may not realize that they're using, but most of the time that's there, even if it's not stated explicitly. One book that I recommend kind of browsing, and it doesn't have everything, right? Keeping in mind it doesn't have everything, but it's still maybe helpful for kind of examining at least some of the major theories within the LIS sphere, is this Theories of Information Behavior book. That you can actually access most of it through Google Books through this link. And once again, I have it in my reference list as well. You can see kind of how different theories can be applied to different problems in LIS. But there's others out there, right? So it's a matter of if you're still uncertain about what's out there, just kind of reading, starting here, reading about, within kind of research methodologies books, find different theories and, theoretical frameworks that may work for what you're trying to do. But I think that oftentimes once you do, that literature review and do some reading, you'll probably start spotting some things that do sound intriguing. But sometimes there may not be a theoretical framework, a particular one applied to your particular topic that you've chosen. So it's good to have a good general overview of what's available and go forward with that. So getting back to my little graphic here. We've gotten through part of most of, I guess, my process here, the iterative research process, and once again kind of going back and forth to ones depending on the need. And so I just wanted to show you we're getting over the hump now, and now into moving from research design to actual data collection. Okay, so that's the next part of the research project. So data collection, as you can imagine, is gathering evidence needed to answer your research questions. And I think that's really key, that answer your research questions part of this, because you don't want to start collecting data that does not answer your research questions, or vice versa, right? So if you have research questions and you start gathering data that doesn't answer them, like you're gathering data and it's not actually answering your research questions, then you need to rethink. Either rethink your questions or rethink your data collection method. And here are some popular data collection methods. This is not, totally comprehensive, so just keep that in mind. But both in quantitative and qualitative approaches, you'll find like surveys, interviews, focus groups, observation, and analyzing documents. So, and there's kind of pros and cons for each of these methods, but it's one of those things that, if kind of going back to what we were talking about that before, about saying, oh, I definitely want to do a qualitative study, like at the very beginning, regardless. It's kind of the same thing here. If you decide, okay, well, I definitely want to do a survey, or I want to do observation, that will then maybe impact what questions you have, what problem that you are focusing on to do that. Because each of these will have kind of, like I said, their own benefits and drawbacks in terms of what they can provide and what they can't. So for example, with my doctoral dissertation research, I thought it was good, since I was trying to determine the perceptions of what quality cataloging is among academic library catalogers. I felt like just analyzing documents is not going to really get me the answer to that question, right? So I could kind of just look at what people have done, but I wanted to ask them, okay, what do you think it is? What do you think quality cataloging is, and how did you come about with your understanding of that, right? So I did use surveys and interviews to capture that information to answer my research questions, but I ultimately I did end up analyzing some documents as well. Just like looking at MARC records that some of my participants gave me, like some that say, okay, this is quality and this is not quality, just so I can actually see, okay, so they're saying this is quality and this is not quality, then are they showing me something that matches what they're actually saying, what I'm saying? So sometimes having multiple data collection methods is important to kind of, back up what each part, what each data collection method is actually showing you. It's just called triangulation, is having, multiple methods to help kind of capture that information and answer your research questions, right? So if your survey data is saying one thing that's completely different from your interview questions, and that's also kind of strange, interesting and strange in its own right, that you can be a part of that in answering your questions. So, why is that the case, right? So it's interesting to kind of think about that. So, but another thing to keep in mind is that, you don't have to actually have a study that requires any sort of interaction with living human beings. Not saying you have to, but that's something that's quite common in LIS research, is to interact with human subjects in some shape or form, and living human subjects. And if you do need to obtain institutional review board approval prior to collecting data. So this is kind of like that in between research, method design, research design, and data collection, is getting that IRB approval to do your research with living human subjects. And if your institution does not have an IRB, you can use another institution's IRB. And IRB approval is important to ensure that your research is being conducted ethically. So not violating privacy, for example, minimizing harm and so forth. Especially with more vulnerable populations such as children, prisoners, pregnant women and so forth. So minimizing harm. We really want to minimize harm to our human subjects. And it may be that, you're bringing up very, emotional topics, right? So depending on your topic, it may be something that someone is very, emotionally invested in, and it may cause them not just physical harm, but like emotional or mental harm. So that's something you have to take into consideration. And if you are doing a survey, using a survey instrument to collect data or interviews and so forth, you'll need to say up front that this survey or this interview questions are IRB approved, right, and so forth. There's kind of certain script you need to include if you are collecting data from human subjects. And there's different levels of review. So I'm not saying that this, sometimes this can be a pretty proactive process, especially if you are doing actual experiments on people. Then typically, especially with children and so forth, you'll want a full level review. But there's other kind of other levels of review, such as expedited and exempt, that are don't take as long to get approval. But it's still good. It's still good to you need to get that approval ahead of time, even if it ends up being exempt. It's the IRB that tells you whether it should be exempt or not. Okay, so just keep that in mind and kind of build that into your timeline. That's something that, like I said, I'm going to talk about here in a few minutes, about if you are set yourself up with a timeline, which is a good idea, by the way. You need to kind of build in that time to get the IRB approval, which depending on the institution may take months and months. So. And I just wanted to point out, just as an example, I want to have some examples of different technical services related studies for you guys to get some idea of kind of what's out there. And I'm just going to put in a plug for my former doctoral student at Dominican Marie McCoury. This is an article that she wrote based off of her doctoral dissertation, where she used domain analysis as kind of the theoretical framework for examining the information needs of music students at a small liberal arts college in the Midwest. Okay, so very, very specific, which that happens, right? That's her little chunk of the literature that she chose to look at, and kind of how and what she did. She wanted to collect data relating to these information needs away from existing systems. So for example, she wanted to know what these music students wanted to know, like how they searched for resources, what information they needed from the resources, but away from the library catalog and library databases. So in order to answer those questions, she really needed some approaches to allow her to collect that data in a way, like I said, away from these existing systems. So she had surveys, as well as did interviews and focus groups to ask the participants for their ideas of kind of how they search for specific music resources and so forth. And then ultimately what she did is just took that information, and she did this at multiple colleges, right, to kind of see if these what she was coming up with, the data that they're providing is all similar, which it was. And she wanted to then compare that information against existing standards, what they require and not require. So just RDA, right? So these music students say, this is the information that I need to access these particular resources that we like. Is RDA saying that we need to include that information in the catalog, right? So, so it's, once again, kind of tooting and my own and Maureen's horn here, but it's a really interesting study. So if you're interested in that, I highly recommend this article on her dissertation if you're interested in that. So anyway, and then data analysis, analyzing and interpreting the data collected. And you want, as you can imagine, just analyzing the data that you collect, and you want to start by preparing and processing the data for analysis. So for example, creating interview scripts. If you've done interviews, you want to create transcripts from that. Downloading your data into a spreadsheet, maybe writing up some formal notes from like observations and so forth, and de-identifying your data to maintain confidentiality, right? If you've said that you're going to maintain the confidentiality of your subjects, then you need to make sure you de-identify them, if at all possible, during this process. And part of that process, the data analysis process, is, you know, once you've kind of done that pre-work to like I said, those various things that I said, you want to then scan the data to just get a general sense of what is being said. And then categorize the data. So if you, for example, have answers to open-ended questions, that should be coded to identify major themes. There's different ways you can approach this, you know, using like a code book, using content analysis, for example. I did that content analysis in my dissertation, as well as like a word frequency analysis and so forth, to kind of categorize my data in a way to kind of identify major themes there. But, you know, there's different ways you can do that. In fact, there is going to be another webinar on, you know, I believe research methodologies and data analysis. So if you want to dig deeper on that, I'm assuming that webinar will probably get more into that. And then interpret the data. So what have you learned from the data collected? How does this compare to what has been documented in the literature? And how does it fit within the theoretical framework or frameworks that you used? What are some important findings and so forth? So kind of look at that through the lens that you're choosing to look through it through. And then kind of compare what's been documented in the literature. So interpret, find the meaning there. And then finally, the last part, I'm almost done here, so we have some time for questions. The last part of the research project is to report your research in some way. And I use reporting and not like writing up or publishing, just because there's different ways you can report your research findings and tell the world about your research if you're proud of it. I guess you want to make sure that your contribution is added to the literature. You know, so there's different ways to report it, which I'll talk about just a second. But you typically want to organize your reports the same order as the research process. So obviously, kind of starting off with kind of stating what the problem is, any research questions that you have, you know, a review of the literature, what your research design is, and so on and so forth. Right, so you want to report it in that way if possible. Also including recommendations for future research, right? So, like just an example, Maureen McCory's study, like I said, she looked very specifically at the music students in small liberal arts college in the Midwest. And she recommended, okay, well, we should look at use domain analysis to examine other domains, like, you know, like chemistry majors, or you know, people who are interested in using, you know, graphic novels and so, right? So there's different other ways that we can take kind of her same framework, her same methodology, and then kind of applying it to other domains and so forth. So you can say that as part of your recommendations, like, okay, well, I recommend in order to kind of get a more complete picture of this topic, you could do this and this and that, right? So that doesn't mean you have to do it, just to kind of get it out there that others are, you know, can take up the mantle and do that. And then also talk about limitations of your studies. So something that I mentioned earlier in my dissertation research is the fact that I mentioned that I felt somewhat limited, ultimately because I was an insider to my group, my catalogers that I studied. And so I do think I kind of missed certain things because of that. And so I felt like ultimately it was a beneficial thing ultimately for understanding what they were saying, but it was also a limitation in a sense. And there's various limitations that you could have in terms of, you know, scope and so forth. Like, look, I chose to look specifically at this particular problem and not these other things just due to, you know, time, money, whatever, right? So, and that's fine. You can say that. You can say, I'm limiting it as long as you state it, right? You just have to make sure it's clear, you know, you're stating your scope and what your limitations are. And there's different ways that you can report your study, like conference presentation, right? You can, you know, present at ALA or other conferences if you want. You also, if you do want to have your work published as well, there are other conferences, such as the Knowledge Organization Group, that also publishes conference proceedings. So kind of take that into consideration if you're kind of choosing which conferences you want to attend to tell everybody about your stuff. But also keep that in mind that you can present before you're even done, right? Using like poster sessions, like I presented my, like the very beginnings, like before I actually started collecting data for my doctoral dissertation, I presented at an interest group meeting. I forget which one, I think it may have been like cataloging norms or something, at the very beginning, just to kind of get some feedback. I'm like, okay, this is what I'm planning to do. What do you guys think? You know, and that was very, very helpful for me to get some feedback on my study before I even started collecting data. The audience would bring up things that I hadn't really thought of, right? So it can be really helpful, like I said, even before you're done to present and like do like a poster session, for example, to get feedback. Also journals, like here, just I have a bulleted list of just some, you know, popular journals in our area and technical services, but feel free to, you can go out, you know, to other journals like the Journal of Documentation, Library Quarterly, you know, and so forth. You don't have to limit yourself to just these, but, you know, keep in mind that these are kind of major ones in our field, but also publish, you know, like a book or a book chapter, right? It doesn't have to be a full book, but I know that, like, you know, not that you guys are going to be writing dissertations necessarily after this, you might, but there are plenty of doctoral students who take their dissertation work and publish it as a book, right? So it's once again another avenue, but also if you just want to do like a book chapter, that's also an option as well. So some recommendations for you all, and then I'll have a few slides on some resources, and then we'll have some time for questions. So first of all, if you're new to research, I just recommend that you find a mentor. So don't feel like you have to go at this alone, completely alone. So finding a mentor, and I'll have some recommendations on how to do that in just a minute. But you know, we can find a mentor, maybe conduct research with a co-investigator, right? So choose someone who maybe has a little bit more experience with research to work together. That's totally fine. You've probably seen plenty of like journal articles or book chapters where you've had co-authors there. So yeah, that can be really helpful as far as support if you're new to this. Okay, so that way you don't feel so alone, and also have someone to kind of double check your work, right? So that can be helpful. As I mentioned before, having a clear timeline can be really, really important, kind of sticking to it as much as possible, because I find that, I know that I'm this way, but I see this with my doc students all the time, is that flexibility tends to lead to procrastination, okay? So if you don't give yourself, you know, a set timeline for completing your research project, then you tend to just like, oh, I'll get to it later. I have this other thing that's too important, you know, I'll get to it later, and then it just keeps dragging on and on and on, right? Just like anything, right? So having that clear timeline is important, as well as having clear expectations and goals, right? So if you are only needing to conduct a research project, you know, to get a promotion at work, right, to keep your job, you know, keep that in mind as you do this, or if you're just doing this purely because you're interested in the topic, that's important to kind of keep in mind. In terms of, you know, the product of this and what you ultimately want to do. So having those clear expectations as goals are important. Okay, and then hold on. In terms of resources, because that was another one of the bullets for this particular webinar, is giving you some ideas of resources you can use to learn more about the research process, each part. And this is a good way to start. You guys are here, so that's important. Way to start. There's other webinars in this series. You can see here they're all listed here, and the next one being the research methodologies and data analysis. If you need to learn more about that, that's going to be fabulous. But other ones like the writing and publishing, assessment, and communicating impact using data visualization hopefully will be very helpful for your research. Also, if you want to just be a part of a larger community of researchers in librarianship, the librarian parlor may be the place for you. This is just, like it says here, is a space for conversing, sharing expertise, and asking questions about the process of developing, pursuing, and publishing library research. And they also send out like an email newsletter every once in a while as well. I get that just to kind of update. So if you'd like to be kind of like a part of an online community that will be helpful and informing you about various things related to researching and just kind of, you know, talking with other people as part of the community, this is a good place to start. Librarian Parlor. Also, Library Juice Academy, if you feel like you need something a bit more formal and structured. I've taken several Library Juice Academy courses, which are all online, by the way. They're usually 4 weeks and about $175 each. They have several these courses on kind of research-related topics, such as research design for librarians, which I think is actually starting soon, by the way. exploring and applying critical theory. I just kind of pulled out a few of these to just kind of look like it would be good and interesting for you all, that if you're interested in research. Like I said, this is a fairly inexpensive way to kind of have a more structured. It is asynchronous, but it still provides some structure and help if you want to learn more about these topics. The ALCTS mentorship program. This goes back to my idea that I suggested, my recommendation for having a mentor. And this ALCTS mentorship program is not specifically for research. I want to reiterate that it's not specifically a research mentorship program. But if you state, right, if you apply for this and you state, I'm really looking for someone who can mentor me on this, I've seen that happen. Like I've done that. Like for the last couple of years, I've been, mentoring some, current like catalogers who, who just needed some support and pursuing their research agenda and how to get started and so forth. And that program, that deadline for that, by the way, because it's done every year. The deadline for that is February 28th, so it's coming up like next week. So if you're interested in having a mentor for research, or you want to be a mentor, this is a great program. And then LIS program course auditing. I know that in Dominican, for example, our alumni are allowed to audit courses for free. And we do have some research methods courses that are available. And just so depending on your program that you've attended or nearby, then they may have a free or discounted rate courses. Once again, if you need something more structured, then I recommend you look into it. Here are some of the book resources that I recommend that you look at if you want to learn more about research. The first and last one specifically about LIS, the two in the middle, not LIS focused, but still very helpful. And here's some of my work cited. Questions. All right. I'm sorry, I kind of went a little bit longer than I was anticipating because I wanted to make sure we had some questions. But I think we have like about 4 minutes according to my clock. So does anyone have any questions about anything that I've said? Maybe something I didn't say that you have a question about?
I'll just jump in to remind everyone that if you do have any questions, to please go ahead and type those into the question box. And we do have, yes, a couple minutes for questions if anyone has any.
Mm-hmm. And if you don't, that's fine too. You can always email me as well. Or like I said, wait for the next webinars if you have some specific questions about those other topics. So. Okay, I think I see some questions. Let's see, hold on. Okay, so one of the questions is, are you going to post the slides? It's my understanding that yes, after this, actually, I shouldn't say that. I'm assuming that the slides will be posted, but I know like the recording will be posted, but I guess Lisa?
Yes, the slides will also get sent out with that email shortly after the webinar is over.
Okay.
And I believe your list of resources in those slides too to address that other question. So.
Exactly. Yeah, the list of resources are part of my PowerPoint slides. So when you get the PowerPoint slides,
okay,
the resources. So all in one package.
Yes. Okay. If those are the only questions we have, I'll stall a little bit just to leave time in case anyone is in the middle of typing anything. But looks like there's one.
Oh, there's one. Okay. Okay, good. So what makes a good poster session? That's a good question. So I think, it may take more time than we have to kind of talk about this, but the posters really should, if you're going to do a poster session, then you literally will have a poster, right? And you want to try to have as many visuals as possible, right? So if you have a lot of text on your poster, that just people tend to get lost in that text. So you want to have as many, like visuals in terms of like, charts or graphs or pictures and so forth, limited amount of text, and really get to the point. Like, what are your main research questions? What is your problem statement? What is your methodology, right? So really kind of focus on the very bare bones of parts of your research study. And then so that people can kind of see the basic components and be able to, not get overwhelmed with what you're presenting, and they'll ask you, right? So if they have more in-depth questions about like your problem statements or your methodology, they'll ask you. So that's what I recommend, is just trying to keep it to a minimum on your actual poster, and then you will then stand. Typically for these poster sessions, you'll stand in front of your poster and you will talk about it. So hopefully that will helpful. So in terms of tips for finding collaborators, it may just depend. Like, I think that being a part of like maybe that librarian parlor community will help. If there's someone at your institution, even in your department, that has conducted some research, it may just be kind of talking with people about that if they've done research. I think that may be a good place to start. But also maybe like if you do go to conferences like the American Library Association conference, like kind of going to sessions and kind of getting an idea, talking to people about if they're interested in doing research. I mean, I know that sometimes that's how I've kind of found collaborators, and we're just kind of talking to people at conferences. So, let's see. And Daniel, that's a good question about the copyright. And I don't really have, I usually tend to just kind of go with what I've kind of given, I guess, in terms of the contract. And I've not really kind of negotiated copyright too much with publishers, but it's a good question. I don't really have an in-depth answer for, but it's something that you're welcome to do, I think, because they do give you various options for that. You just kind of have to kind of ask about it.
I'll just jump in, Karen. We have a few more questions that came in, so I think we are pretty much out of time, though. But if it's all right, since you did offer to answer those in writing, we can always send those answers out later via email, if that's okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Okay. So we are so glad you could all be with us today. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please do take a few minutes to respond to the questions if you can. Your comments are very valuable and help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include links to today's slides and recording, and you now have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance. That information will also be in the email. So thank you again to our presenter, Karen Snow, and thanks also to the members of the Continuing Education Committee, Iping Chen Gaffey, Dana Hanford, and to Alana Warren from the ALCTS office. The support they provide makes it possible for us to present these webinars. And just briefly, ALCTS has other continuing education events coming up. Please see the ALCTS website to register or find more information on this and other upcoming webinars. And ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will be on March 19th, discussing knowledge-based management. And please check the website for information on upcoming courses and discussions. Thank you again all for joining us today, and this concludes our session.